The morning light filtered through tall windows, casting long shadows across silent factory floors where dust motes danced in the stillness. Across America, in the autumn of 1929, a peculiar quiet had begun to settle over the industrial landscape, a hush that would deepen into a profound silence lasting nearly a decade. The great engines of American manufacturing, those magnificent symbols of progress that had roared through the previous decades, now stood motionless. Their massive iron frames cooling in shuttered buildings, from Pittsburgh to Detroit, from textile mills in Massachusetts to steel foundries in Gary, Indiana. This was the beginning of the 1930s, a decade that would test the American spirit in ways the nation had never known, yet paradoxically lay the foundation for the most prosperous era the country would ever see. The story of how this happened, how a nation brought to its knees by economic catastrophe, transformed itself into the industrial colossus that would dominate the 20th century, is one of the most remarkable chapters in American history. It is a story told not just in statistics and legislation, though these have their place, but in the lives of ordinary people who found themselves navigating an extraordinary time. It is found in the hands of men who once operated punch presses and lathes, now standing in bread lines. It is written in the faces of women who had never worked outside the home, now seeking any employment they could find. And it is preserved in the blueprints and patents filed during those lean years, innovations born of necessity that would revolutionize how Americans lived and worked. To understand the 1930s, one must first grasp what came before. The 1920s had been a time of unprecedented industrial expansion. Factories hummed with activity 24 hours a day. The assembly line, perfected by Henry Ford in the previous decade, had transformed manufacturing from a skilled craft into a science of efficiency. Automobiles, once luxury items, now filled the streets of every major city. Radios brought entertainment into homes across the nation. Electric lighting illuminated not just the cities but increasingly the countryside as well. The stock market climbed to dizzying heights, and a new prosperity seemed within reach of every hardworking American. But this prosperity rested on unstable foundations. American industry had expanded far beyond what the market could sustain. Factories produced more goods than consumers could purchase. Farmers, benefiting from mechanization, grew more crops than the market demanded, driving prices down until many could barely cover their costs. The stock market, driven by speculation rather than sound investment, had become a casino where fortunes were made and lost on the basis of rumor and hope rather than genuine value. Banks lent money with reckless abandon, often securing loans with stocks that had no real worth behind them. The entire system had become a tower built on sand, and all it took was a strong wind to bring it crashing down. That wind came in late October 1929. On Thursday, the 24th, panic selling gripped the New York Stock Exchange. Stocks that had seemed solid investments just days before became worthless paper. By the following Tuesday, billions of dollars in value had simply evaporated. But this was more than just a stock market crash. The collapse rippled through every sector of the economy with devastating speed. Banks that had invested heavily in stocks found themselves insolvent overnight. When banks failed, they took with them the life savings of thousands of depositors who had believed their money was safe. With banks collapsing, credit disappeared. Without credit, businesses could not operate. Without operating businesses, workers lost their jobs. Without jobs, workers could not buy goods. Without customers, more businesses failed, and the cycle spiraled ever downward. The speed with which prosperity turned to desperation stunned Americans who had grown accustomed to thinking of progress as inevitable. Within a year of the crash, 4 million Americans were unemployed. By 1933, that number had swollen to 13 million, nearly a quarter of the entire workforce. But these stark numbers cannot capture the human reality they represented. Behind each statistic was a man who had worked steadily for 20 years, now unable to provide for his family. A woman who watched her children go hungry because there was no work to be found. an elderly couple who lost their home because they could no longer pay the mortgage. The factories, those great temples of American industrial might, fell silent one by one. In Detroit, automobile production plummeted. Plants that had employed thousands now stood empty, their parking lots growing weeds through cracks in the pavement. In the steel towns of Pennsylvania and Ohio, the furnaces went cold. The red glow that had illuminated the night sky for decades faded to black. Textile mills throughout New England locked their doors. Coal mines in Appalachia reduced their shifts or closed entirely, leaving miners with no source of income in regions where few alternatives existed. A machinist named Thomas Brennan kept a diary during these years, and his entries capture the disorientation many felt. In November 1930, he wrote, "Came to the plant this morning as usual. Found the gates locked. A notice posted. 22 years I've worked these machines, and now they tell us there's no more work." Stood there with the other men, none of us quite believing it. Where do we go from here? Brennan's question echoed across America. Where did any of them go from there? For many, the answer was nowhere. They stayed where they were because they had no money to go anywhere else. Communities that had thrived on industry found themselves transformed into places of quiet desperation. Men who had once taken pride in their work now felt shame at their inability to find employment. The psychological toll was immense. Suicide rates climbed. Marriages crumbled under the strain. Children grew up in an atmosphere of anxiety and want, their parents unable to provide even basic necessities. Yet even in this darkness, something remarkable was happening, though few could see it at the time. The crisis was forcing Americans to reconsider fundamental assumptions about how their economy and society functioned. The old faith in unregulated markets and minimal government had been shaken. If the system could fail so completely, then perhaps the system itself needed to be rebuilt. This realization would lead to changes that would reshape American industry and American life in ways that persist to this day. The election of Franklin Delano Roosevelt in 1932 marked a turning point. Roosevelt understood that the crisis demanded action on an unprecedented scale. Within his first 100 days in office, his administration launched a series of programs collectively known as the New Deal, aimed at providing relief to the unemployed, stimulating economic recovery, and reforming the financial system to prevent future collapses. Some of these programs would prove more successful than others, but together they represented a fundamental shift in how Americans thought about the relationship between government and the economy. Among the most significant New Deal initiatives were programs that put Americans back to work, building the infrastructure the nation desperately needed. The Civilian Conservation Corps employed young men to plant trees, build parks, and construct roads through wilderness areas. The Works Progress Administration funded everything from highway construction to the building of schools and hospitals. The Tennessee Valley Authority brought electricity to vast rural regions that had never known it. These were not make-work programs designed simply to provide paychecks. They were investments in America's future, creating the foundation upon which post-war prosperity would be built. But the New Deal did more than build roads and dams. It fundamentally changed the relationship between workers and employers, between labor and capital. The National Industrial Recovery Act, passed in 1933, gave workers the right to organize and bargain collectively. When that law was struck down by the Supreme Court, the Wagner Act of 1935 restored and strengthened these rights. For the first time, American workers had legal protection when they sought to form unions and negotiate for better wages and working conditions. The Fair Labor Standards Act of 1938 established a minimum wage and a 40-hour workweek, with overtime pay for hours beyond that. Child labor was restricted and eventually banned. These changes did not come easily or without resistance. Employers fought them fiercely, and violent confrontations between workers and company security forces or police were common throughout the decade. In 1937, striking auto workers occupied the General Motors plant in Flint, Michigan, in what became known as the Flint sit-down strike. For 44 days, workers remained inside the factory, preventing the company from operating or bringing in replacement workers. The strike ended when General Motors recognized the United Auto Workers Union, a victory that would transform labor relations across American industry. Stories from these labor struggles reveal both the hardship and the determination of workers during this period. A woman named Margaret Colby, who worked in a textile mill in North Carolina, later recalled those years. "We worked 12-hour days, 6 days a week, for wages that barely kept our families fed. When we tried to organize, the company fired the ringleaders and blacklisted them so they couldn't find work anywhere else. But we kept trying, kept pushing, because we knew our children deserved better. And eventually, we won." While workers fought for their rights and the government built infrastructure, another quiet revolution was taking place in factories and workshops across America. The economic crisis had forced engineers and inventors to think differently about manufacturing. With labor cheap and capital scarce, the emphasis shifted from labor-saving devices to machines that could do more with less material and less energy. The 1930s saw remarkable innovations in industrial processes, many of which would become fundamental to modern manufacturing. Plastic, which had existed in various forms for decades, came into its own during the 1930s. DuPont introduced nylon in 1935, a synthetic fiber that would revolutionize the textile industry. Acrylic and polystyrene plastics were developed and commercialized during this decade. These materials were cheaper than the metals and natural fibers they replaced, making them ideal for an economy where cost-cutting was essential. But they also had properties that made them superior for many applications. They were lighter, more durable, and more versatile than traditional materials. The electrical industry advanced dramatically during the 1930s as well. Fluorescent lighting was introduced commercially in 1938, providing light that was both brighter and more energy efficient than incandescent bulbs. Air conditioning, which had been a luxury found only in theaters and a few public buildings, began to be installed in more locations, though it would not become common in homes until after World War II. Refrigerators became standard appliances in American homes during this decade, fundamentally changing how families stored and prepared food. In the realm of heavy industry, new alloys and manufacturing techniques were developed that would prove crucial in the years ahead. Stainless steel, which had been invented earlier but was expensive to produce, became more affordable as new refining techniques were perfected. Aluminum, once considered a precious metal, became increasingly common as extraction processes improved. These developments would prove vital when America entered World War II and needed to rapidly expand its production of aircraft, ships, and military equipment. The automobile industry, despite the economic devastation of the early 1930s, continued to innovate. In 1934, Chrysler introduced the Airflow, a car designed with aerodynamics in mind, a radical departure from the boxy designs that had dominated the industry. Though the Airflow itself was not a commercial success, it influenced automotive design for decades to come. Independent front suspension, which made cars ride more smoothly, became common during this period. V8 engines, once found only in expensive luxury cars, were made affordable for ordinary buyers. These technological advances did not happen in isolation from the social and economic changes sweeping the nation. Indeed, they were intertwined with them. The reforms that gave workers more rights and better pay helped create a stronger consumer base for American products. As wages rose and working hours decreased, workers had both more money and more time to spend it. This increased demand helped pull the economy out of its downward spiral. The infrastructure projects undertaken by the federal government not only employed millions, but also made American industry more efficient by improving transportation networks and providing reliable electrical power to regions that lacked it. The 1930s also saw significant changes in who worked in America's factories. The economic crisis forced many women into the workforce who had never worked outside the home before. While most industrial jobs remained dominated by men, women increasingly found employment in light manufacturing, particularly in electronics and textile industries. This was a preview of the massive influx of women into industrial work that would come during World War II, when millions of men left for military service and women filled their places on assembly lines and in machine shops. The experience of African Americans during this period was complex and often contradictory. The Great Migration, which had brought hundreds of thousands of Black Americans from the rural South to northern industrial cities in search of better opportunities, continued through the 1930s despite the economic depression. In the North, Black workers found greater opportunities than in the Jim Crow South, but they also faced discrimination in hiring and were often the first to be laid off when times were hard. Labor unions, which might have been natural allies, were often segregated or excluded Black workers entirely. Yet, the New Deal programs, while not free from discrimination, did provide employment opportunities and aid to many African American families. The seeds of the civil rights movement that would flower in later decades were planted during this time, as Black Americans gained a stronger foothold in industrial employment and began to organize for better treatment. The cultural impact of factory work during the 1930s extended far beyond the factory walls. Industrial labor shaped community identities and family structures. In towns built around a single industry, everyone's fortunes rose and fell together. When the factory was running, the town thrived. When it closed, the entire community suffered. This created a strong sense of solidarity and mutual dependence. People looked out for their neighbors because they knew that next month they might be the ones in need. Factory work also influenced American popular culture during this decade. The struggles of working people became subjects for writers, photographers, and filmmakers. John Steinbeck's novel, The Grapes of Wrath, published in 1939, told the story of Oklahoma farmers displaced by the Dust Bowl and their journey to California in search of work. Though it focused on agricultural workers, it captured the desperation and resilience of all working Americans during this period. Photographers like Dorothea Lange documented the faces of the Depression, creating images that would become iconic representations of the era. Their work was often commissioned by federal agencies seeking to build support for New Deal programs, but the emotions they captured were genuine and powerful. Music, too, reflected the experiences of workers during this time. Folk musicians like Woody Guthrie wrote songs about union organizing, unemployment, and the struggles of common people. The blues, which had originated in the rural South, found new audiences in northern industrial cities, where Black migrants brought their musical traditions with them. These songs spoke to universal experiences of hardship and hope, creating a cultural archive of the decade that would influence American music for generations. The late 1930s brought gradual improvement to the American economy, though full recovery would not come until the nation mobilized for World War II. Factory production began to increase. Unemployment, while still high by historical standards, declined from its devastating peak. The reforms instituted during the decade began to bear fruit. Workers with better wages and shorter hours proved to be more productive, not less. Unions, rather than destroying industry as opponents had predicted, helped stabilize it by creating predictable labor relations and reducing the wild fluctuations in wages and working conditions that had characterized earlier eras. The infrastructure built during the 1930s transformed the American landscape. The Hoover Dam, completed in 1936, provided electricity to millions and enabled the development of the Southwest. The Grand Coulee Dam in Washington state, finished in 1942 but begun in the 1930s, was the largest concrete structure in the world and provided power for a vast region. Rural electrification programs brought light and power to farms that had never had it, fundamentally changing agricultural life. Roads built by the Works Progress Administration connected remote communities to the broader economy. Schools, hospitals, post offices, and other public buildings constructed during this period served their communities for decades. Perhaps most importantly, the 1930s changed how Americans thought about themselves and their relationship to their government and economy. The crisis had shattered the old belief that unregulated markets would automatically provide prosperity for all who worked hard. In its place came a new understanding that government had a responsibility to protect its citizens from the worst excesses of capitalism, to provide a safety net for those who fell through the cracks, and to invest in the infrastructure and education necessary for long-term prosperity. This consensus, sometimes called the New Deal Coalition, would dominate American politics for the next 4 decades. The lessons learned in the factories and workshops of the 1930s extended beyond mere technical innovation. American industry emerged from the Depression more efficient, more organized, and more humane than it had entered it. The arbitrary power that employers once held over workers had been curbed. The dangerous working conditions that had maimed and killed so many in earlier decades were gradually eliminated. Child labor, once common in mills and mines, became a relic of the past. The 8-hour day and the 5-day workweek, once radical demands of labor organizers, became standard practice. When World War II began in Europe in 1939, and especially after America entered the conflict in 1941, the stage had been set for the greatest industrial mobilization in human history. The factories that had stood silent in the early 1930s roared back to life, producing aircraft, ships, tanks, and weapons in quantities that staggered the imagination. The infrastructure built during the Depression proved invaluable in moving materials and finished goods across the continent. The skilled workers who had fought for their rights in the 1930s now turned their talents to winning a war. The manufacturing techniques developed during the lean years of the Depression were refined and expanded to meet wartime demands. And crucially, the social compact forged during the 1930s held firm through the war and beyond. Workers accepted wage controls during the conflict because they knew their government would protect their right to organize after it ended. Companies invested in training and equipment because stable labor relations allowed them to plan for the future. The result was an industrial boom that lasted for decades, creating a broad middle class and a level of widely shared prosperity America had never known before. A machinist named Robert Chen, who had started his career during the Depression years, later reflected on what he had witnessed. When I first walked into a factory in 1934, I was just grateful to have a job, any job. The pay was terrible. The hours were long, and if you complained, you were out on the street. But we organized, we fought, and by the end of the decade, things had changed. Not completely, not perfectly, but they had changed. We had a voice. We had protections. And when the war came, we used everything we'd learned to build the machines that won it. Those were hard years, the 30s. But they taught us what we could do when we worked together. The 1930s also left a legacy in the physical landscape of America that remains visible today. Thousands of buildings constructed by New Deal programs still serve their communities. The roads, bridges, and dams built during that decade remain in use. The national parks developed by the Civilian Conservation Corps provide recreation for millions. Less tangibly, but no less importantly, the social programs created during the 1930s, Social Security foremost among them, continue to provide security for elderly and disabled Americans. The principle that government has a responsibility to protect its citizens from destitution, once controversial, became so deeply embedded in American life that even politicians who criticized specific programs generally accepted the basic premise. The industrial innovations of the 1930s, too, continue to shape modern life. The plastics developed during that decade form the basis of countless products used every day. The electrical technologies refined in Depression-era laboratories, power homes, and businesses. The manufacturing techniques pioneered then, refined over subsequent decades, make possible the complex global supply chains that characterize modern industry. In ways large and small, the 1930s remain with us, a foundation upon which later prosperity was built. Yet perhaps the most important legacy of the 1930s is not material but spiritual. That decade taught Americans that adversity could be overcome, that reform was possible, that ordinary people working together could change their circumstances. The generation that lived through the Depression carried those lessons with them for the rest of their lives. They taught their children to save for hard times, to value security over speculation, to appreciate what they had because they remembered what it was like to have nothing. They built the post-war suburbs and filled them with families, seeking to provide their children with the stability they themselves had lacked in their youth. This Depression generation, as they came to be called, earned a reputation for stoicism and resilience. They had survived the worst economic catastrophe in American history, and then gone on to win the deadliest war in human history. They had transformed American industry, American society, and America's place in the world. They did not do this because they were somehow stronger or better than other generations, but because circumstances demanded it and they rose to meet those demands. They were factory workers and farmers, engineers and laborers, men and women who found within themselves the strength to endure and the courage to build anew. The factories of the 1930s, whether standing silent in the early years of the decade or humming with renewed activity as it drew to a close, were more than just buildings filled with machinery. They were places where America's future was forged, where workers learned to organize and fight for their rights, where innovations were developed that would transform daily life, where the foundation was laid for unprecedented prosperity. The dreams of those who walked through factory gates during those years, dreams of security and dignity and a better life for their children, were not mere fantasies. They were blueprints for the future. And through hard work and determination and collective action, those dreams became reality. As the 1930s ended and a new decade began, Americans could not know what the future held. The gathering storm clouds of war in Europe cast long shadows, and many feared the nation would soon be drawn into another global conflict. But they faced this uncertainty with greater confidence than they had possessed 10 years earlier. They had survived the worst and emerged stronger. Their factories, once silent, were ready to produce. Their workers, once demoralized, were organized and determined. Their government, once paralyzed by adherence to outdated dogma, had learned to take bold action when circumstances demanded it. The story of the 1930s is ultimately a story of transformation. A nation brought low by economic collapse rebuilt itself, not by returning to the way things had been before, but by creating something new. The changes made during that decade, in factories and in laws, in technology and in social relations, shaped the America that emerged as a global superpower after World War II. The prosperity of the 1950s and 1960s, the broad middle class that became the envy of the world, the industrial might that made America the arsenal of democracy, all had their roots in the 1930s. Those who lived through that decade, who worked in those factories and fought those fights, who dreamed those dreams and slowly, painfully made them real, deserve to be remembered, not just for what they endured, but for what they built. They transformed America from a nation in crisis to one poised for greatness. They proved that even in the darkest times, progress is possible, that reform can work, that ordinary people can change their world. This is the legacy of the 1930s, preserved not just in buildings and machines, but in the institutions and values that continue to shape American life. In the silent factories of the early Depression and the roaring production lines of the war years that followed, modern America was born.